this is the 191 Policy Review Committee meeting with school board members and faculty. So welcome everyone. It is Tuesday, June the 9th. We have 3 policies we'll be looking at today on our agenda. The first 2 are policies with changes, policy 532 and policy 615. And Stephanie White will be presenting those. So Stephanie.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start with policy 532 and the recommendations from MSBA. I will recommend that we move forward with as they reflect our current practices. And if you look at the end of the policy, it'll talk about how we report our restricted procedures and the specific dates that go along with that. And this has been in place for a little while. Prone restraints have been restricted or not allowed for several years. And the state is really focused on seclusions. And so they've been having us report those for several years as well. And those are the dates that align with what they're requiring us to do. And so I believe that this is a really good revision and keeps us all informed on current practice.
And also just for our recording audience too, this is policy 532, use of peace officers and crisis teams to remove students with IEPs from school grounds is the policy that we're discussing. Do we have any other comments or thoughts from the rest of the committee?
I do have a question, not about the revision, but about a couple other parts of the policy, if that's okay.
Sure.
So under definitions, so 3F, it says student with an IEP or the student, this is the definition section. Student with an IEP or the student means a student who is eligible to receive special education and related services. So is there a difference between students that are eligible to receive it and the students who actually have it?
Yep. And
okay.
What they're referring to is once we suspect a student has a disability or we are investigating that the student has a disability through an evaluation process, then all of the guidelines around that apply.
Okay.
And so that's what they're referring to at that.
So, okay. So I'm thinking about this policy, like it talks later. Okay. So like my other, so come back to, let's go back to go to my next question then, because it kind of relates to this. So under 4A, the removal by the crisis team, it says to de-escalate using that each student's IEP as the guideline. So how does the crisis team know? We must have a lot of students with IEPs. And so how do they know what's in each student's IEP?
Yep, it's a good question. So not every student has a specific plan, but typically if a student has concerns around behaviors or needs for support, we have a functional behavior analysis as well as a behavior intervention plan.
Okay.
And so the crisis team, which is, wording that which really describes the team that supports that student when those situations arise. And that can be different for different students depending on what the needs are, but we try to make that the people who know the student the best.
Okay, so because it just seems like in this sort of situation where things can be escalating quickly and the student's in crisis mode, this can be, you can't really like pause to go look at the IEP and see what's going on. So
yeah, and if we have a student who the technical guideline is 2 times in 30 school days can be considered a crisis, and then if it's more than that, then we develop that FBA, that functional behavior assessment, as well as the behavior intervention plan.
Right.
And so it doesn't happen as much as you think. we are pretty prepared, and we
Yep.
let people know and kind of be as proactive as we possibly can so that students get that support.
Yeah, and I'm not,
Or it gets to this.
okay, yeah, and I'm not questioning any of that process or anything, but just thinking about like what this policy, how it reads and how it can be interpreted by parents. And so, because I guess mostly parents, who this would be kind of important information for. And so that's why I'm kind of curious. And so then kind of that leads back to then my question about students who are, that in the definitions, as you said, not all students have an IEP. And so how does, okay, so, because there may be students who fall under, who would qualify for an IEP who have not either yet been identified or a plan has not yet been developed, right?
There may be.
Yeah, there may be, right. Okay, and again, it might be very few, but I want to make sure our policy is comprehensive. And so how do we, I guess, how do we phrase this? So I guess, I guess maybe Brian, you can figure out what I'm trying to talk about here. But so a student gets into a crisis, it has to be dealt with, and even escalating to the point of the SRO, intervening, but that's not a student who has an IEP. And so, but yet should have been like covered underneath these guidelines. I guess that's where I'm trying to find if we have to make sure we don't have a hole here of any kind. So does that make sense? Because you say that the definition is students who may be eligible. So this doesn't just cover students who have IEPs, but students who would be eligible for IEPs if they were identified to be so. And so there's going to be some students that we've not yet identified as needing IEPs. But yet when their crisis comes along, should they have one, they should be covered, they should be worked under this policy as opposed to a regular crisis intervention policy. And so that's where I'm trying to find out, is this a language issue, that we want to be thoughtful of here, or what exactly is that? Am I making any sense whatsoever about what I'm trying to understand?
I think when I think about this policy, just because of the title, this is really specifically about students with IEPs and making sure that they have, fair treatment, just based on that. Okay. And I think that because we have that pyramid of intervention, we have so many things that happen prior to a moment that this is addressing.
Yep.
I think teams do a really good job of knowing who should potentially be considered having a disability or might have a disability and following these guidelines.
Okay, yeah, and I have no doubt of that whatsoever. And so this is maybe a language issue in here then, because if this is just about IEPs, we can't really say in our definitions that this covers students who may be eligible for IEPs, because then that's saying they don't, because they don't actually have an IEP.
But we're mandated to treat students as if they did have a disability if we suspect it at all.
Okay.
That's the mandate. So that's why that language is in there. Does that help?
Yeah, yes. And so, yeah. Okay. So, and I don't want to build I'm not trying to create a problem where one may not exist, but this feels incomplete somehow, with this language, but I don't have, and so I'm trying to, come at it from a parent point of view, that my child, my child has a crisis of some kind. My child does not have an IEP, but yet, something has happened in my child's life that they, maybe should, they've developed some disability, they have something, where they should be covered. They should be worked under this policy as opposed to a regular, removal or disciplinary process policy. Mm-hmm. And so, so that's where I don't, yeah. Okay, Brian, help. But you can see where I'm trying to, like, this feels incomplete to me somehow. And I'm not entirely sure, because I completely trust the process of what you're doing. I'm not questioning that in any way. But but this is about policy and language and how it can be interpreted and what it actually covers on this. And so it might even be something like adding in a definition here, or adding in some language that says that reflects the process that we have, that any student who the staff feels should have an IEP or has any sort of disability is follows under this category. Because as you said, Stephanie, the title of this one is Students with an IEP, hard stop. That's what it is. And so, but yet we have language in here that says, oh, but this also covers students who don't have an IEP. And so that's where my disconnect is.
To have a disability.
Yeah, something. So you can see that's where the disconnect is with me, is that we're saying this policy covers this policy covers A, but that in practical use or practical purposes, it also covers B, students who may at some point in the future have an IEP or should be considered one or something. So so somehow I feel like there should be some coverage in there for either tightening down this language of F that says it just covers students with an IEP, or we add language that says this also applies to students who the staff believes has a disability of some form, because they would also, as you say, Stephanie, they go through this process. And so that's where I want to kind of, I guess, one way or the other, clarify this.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add one other note. I think, Stephanie, if you're gaining an understanding kind of what the kind of loophole and the question mark is, this may be worth a call over to Terry Morrow at MSBA, just to find out if there's maybe another model policy that we haven't adopted, or if they have suggestions as to what that might look like. It might be worth that additional check with someone at MSBA about that too, just to talk that through. It may be inadvertent and it may be deliberate. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not trying to cause you any trouble here. It just feels like there's a bit of a disconnect.
Remind me, it's F, and then what was the other one that it stood out to you?
Well, it's so you answered that, about what the student, how they know that what each student's IEP is, because they're very familiar with that, and so I guess that also is kind of supports the idea that this should just be about IEP students. And if we need to create another policy that is about students without an IEP, a related one to this that reflects much the same language, then fine. But this under 4A, where it says those described in the student's IEP, well, if they don't have an IEP, then what does the crisis team do? And again, I'm not questioning what we're doing or that we're effective or anything. This is really about language, in our policy.
Okay, I can do that.
Sorry. Okay, great. Sorry, I have one more. Okay, so then under 4C, we don't define reasonable force anywhere in this policy. So we might want to add that somewhere.
As a definition?
Yeah, something. But we frequently reference reasonable force, and we don't actually define it anywhere.
I think the statute references, Stephanie, we'd have to go into that statute.
I see it, yeah.
Yeah, because corporal punishment is not considered reasonable. I think you may find something in the statute, so we'll look.
Yeah, okay. So, this might be something as we define the other portions of this, that might be important, because that's certainly going to be a question of if there was an issue of any kind, or a question of how a student was handled. We want to make sure that our definitions cover what that is, because that seems very open to interpretation.
Yeah, they spend time telling you what it isn't.
Yes,
Mhm,
which, yeah, which
mhm.
is a popular lawyer tactic, but we might just want a little phrase about what it is actually. So
Mhm, mhm.
even
Got
if it
it.
references the couple lines and then references the statute again or whatever. But,
Yep, I can look into that.
great. Okay, that's it. Sorry, I know it's not.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
I mean, I think that, and what I typically do is pull other districts, and some districts don't have this policy either. And then the ones who do, are just kind of using that. And so we could certainly, work to kind of align what you're thinking there.
Yeah, just coming from a parent standpoint, it doesn't. Where does my child, who doesn't have an IEP but yet has been identified as having disability, where's the policy that covers how that student is handled in these kind of situations?
But I think that would
And
need
I
to be
think
defined in terms of the disability, because I think the parameters in which an IEP is set up isn't necessarily exclusive to somebody with a variety of, like there's certain things that define what qualify for an IEP versus somebody who has another disability that isn't going to require an IEP that is related to behavioral intervention or like learning disability or learning, help. And so if a child who has a quote unquote disability isn't defined under the things that are essential to be covered under an IEP, does this policy even fit them?
Right. Yep, exactly. And so
I would say no.
Yeah, and it's fine if this is narrowly written to just cover students with an IEP, but then we can't have language that says students who may be eligible for an IEP, because that leaves it open to more students that aren't actually covered. So that's
I just wanted to add back to the question about the giving a definition for reasonable force. So this policy also references Minnesota statute authorized use of force. And with the current events, I think we need to be very clear about what we mean. And as you know, we and others are looking at what's allowable.
Okay.
And so I think we take a close look at what's authorized. And if we believe what's authorized in the state of Minnesota is not what we think a peace officer should do, I think we should be very clear.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, it's just, and because, the references are there for, just for reference, and our definitions are for, I guess, ease of understanding. And I don't think we could expect a parent to research the statutes. So a little definition would be good.
Good.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie.
Great. So you'll make some changes and bring it back then to a future meeting. Okay.
Do some research. Yep.
Okay. So then the next policy we're reviewing with Stephanie is policy 615, testing accommodations, modifications, and exemptions for IEPs in section 504 plans and EL students.
That's good. And the one recommendation for this is just an update again on our procedure. And that is in section 3, definition of terms, that you can go on to the state site, Minnesota Department of Education, but that it's also available on Minnesota Pearson Access Next.com. And that gives direct information to parents or whoever where to find the most current information around accommodations, modifications. Pearson is our partner with that. So I would recommend that we do that as well.
Any other thoughts or questions on this policy from Scott or Darcy? I didn't have any.
I'm good.
Okay. Great. We're moving along on that one then. And then the last policy is the new policy we had reviewed the last time we met when asked for some clarifications or changes from Brian regarding policy 599, memorials for deceased students or staff. So we'll turn that over to Brian. You're muted, Brian.
I'm not very good at lip reading. I'm not very good at lip reading,
Yeah.
Brian. So you're like,
I almost never do that, but this is one of the almost. Are you able to see my screen?
yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the opportunity here. This is the second time we've had this as a new policy in front of us. So certainly understanding that after the first ever time seeing it, there were going to be potentially some questions, and I would anticipate that could certainly happen again after this meeting. But what I did was I tried to go back through the policy and put in some of the changes and the recommendations, and I'll just kind of try to flip through those and explain them as we go. The first one, if you see highlighted in yellow, that's added language. Strike throughs are removed from the last time you saw this policy. The first one was to add donations into objects activities was there before, and that was to make sure that it was consistent with language that came later in permanent memorials section of this policy that had talked about things like endowments or donations of books or other materials, and it didn't seem to quite fit between objects and activities, and so added donations to the language to be consistent with that. Down here in section 3, I think there was some general question. We had been using CRT as crisis response team, and it had been defined up above here in E. I apologize, I think that should have had a strike through. But we had 2 crisis response teams, a building and a district. And to eliminate that confusion, we just took out the use of CRT and made it consistent that it was building here in part A. And later, I believe in G is where you see the actual district crisis response team. And again, some happens at the building level, other things are governed a bit more by the district response team to develop those practices. Yep, and I think that's what that those strike throughs and language reflect. The next changes here, you'll notice here in living memorials, I think there was some confusion as to what that meant and almost seemed a little counterintuitive. In visiting with Dana Tompkins, and if you remember, it was Dana and her team that really were the spearheaded this whole process. So appreciated as we went back and visited. It did seem like it created more confusion than the intent, and striking it out really didn't, take away from what we were trying to accomplish with this. So just took out living memorials to not have that be like planting the tree, which is still a permanent memorial that we would want to be covered under this policy. There was a question last time, and I'll bring it back around here in a minute, to cross-reference to policy 899, which is about naming our buildings. And I think there was a desire to make sure we were cross-referencing that and not conflicting. As I read through the intent of 899, I think we're okay in that there is clear language that if a building or facility is be named after an individual, that person shall have attained local or national prominence via significant contributions in a field or endeavor. Contributions or the significance of his or her place shall be clearly established beyond the generation of the contribution. So truly the tie is more about contribution than it is about a financial tie. So I do think 899 stands clear of potential conflict with the memorials policy and the intent of that. And certainly that's my opinion. Certainly open for the board committee here to debate if they believe there needs to be some firmer language. I'll certainly defer that to you if you want to discuss that more. Per our discussion, part of the intent of the policy was not to do, and it states right there in part E, of treating suicide different than other normal death as stated in the policy. So as we discussed, we did want to pull out the separation of that language. I think that was probably old version that was unnecessary. So you'll see that's the strike through of memorials after suicide. What you'll notice is now then obviously continuing on from D to E so that it flows straight through. And the combination of those first 2 statements that were in that next section. The first part you'll see when we strike through students, it was the desire of the board or the comment that we had in the last meeting to generalize as opposed to saying of student versus adult, but just in general. But that latter language where we did combine from B up above was previously B about the important role that schools play. It is more intentional with the focus on students and what we would be doing with our students and our community during that particular time. But again, that's the strike through, and the lower part is simply moving that to combine those sentences. And I believe that was also a discussion from the committee meeting last time through. What that does then is it continues on through just with some numbering differences. And then there was kind of a question about the fit of this statement, which talked about anniversaries and how we do that. What we did was, it is a practice, that is something we do, but determined it might be best just to strike that. It really doesn't impact memorials. It doesn't, how we provide support to students and grief support who might, we talked about how on anniversaries, our counselors or support groups or grief groups watch out for students in these cases. It's probably not related to memorials, which is what this policy's intent is to govern memorials. So that's the intent of that strike through. H is just renumbering from the previous version. And then what you'll see below too is 4 additional cross references. Those were not there. I shouldn't say additional, 4 cross references that were not there in our previous meeting. Acceptance of gifts, equal access, emergency operations, and then of course 899, which came up last time, which talks about the naming of school buildings and facilities. One thing I just, because I took a minute to review that policy, I just have a question about that, but maybe I'll separate that from feedback from policy 599, and then just make a quick observation about 899 for the group to consider for future policy revisions. But those would be the changes from the last version that we had.
Great, thank you, Brian. Anybody have initial thoughts or comments?
I don't have a question, but I do feel that this accurately reflects the very long conversation we had on the last meeting about this policy. So thank you for all the work that was done on it. I did notice, this is really minor, in the section about that mentions the death by suicide, I think deceased, it may be misspelled, was highlighted in yellow. And I was like, I don't think that looks right.
You're right. Yep. Thank you for pointing that out. I appreciate that.
But otherwise, I think I'm good with the policy as it's been updated.
I see another typo too with the screen that we have, that A is AA twice there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna note that too.
Thank you. Yep.
Darcy, do you have anything?
Oh, and this is, yeah, certainly a, certainly, as you said, Scott, reflects the conversation that we had, you know, and then that they went on to make some other, you know, really some other good changes as well that I don't know that we even discussed. And so it, I think it's a really good, actually, I guess I have one question about year. So I guess is this policy then, so it's about deceased students or staff, right? And so like in yearbooks under H1, it just has a student who has died, maybe acknowledge the year of the death. And so are we assuming that that the yearbook staff or students would not want to commemorate a staff member, a teacher, or someone else in a yearbook? Because this is just limited to students.
Yeah, hearing that intent last time, where applicable, to make that more generic, that it could cover a student or staff. Unless there's an objection, I would try to find either a student or staff and just put that in there so it clarifies it, or some other similar generic language.
Yeah, I would say for consistency's sake, that was the one comment I was going to have. It's for consistency's sake, where it's just naming student specific. In a death, it should be student or staff, because I know that, you know, staff are in yearbooks and pictured in yearbooks. And I think there was another one previous to that too. Oh yeah, so letter F, where it said make sure to be sensitive to the cultural needs of the student and the family. So the student that had passed away, but it should be also the staff and their family, if it's, you know, for the cultural needs of the staff, if they're the deceased as well.
Can you help me again with where that reads?
F.
New F.
New F. C crossed out.
Yes, thank you.
Highlighted.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Could you repeat that again? What you had observed on that statement? It's just about.
It was at the last sentence where it said make sure to be sensitive to cultural needs of the student and the family. But
Yep.
it should be the deceased staff. So it's not just the student, it'd be the staff too, who is deceased. So it should be student or staff, or is it student / staff? However you need to make it so that it's
Right. So the first sentence of that paragraph is appropriate because it's the student's friends.
mhm,
But the last one, be sure to sensitive to the cultural needs of the deceased.
mhm.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
Or deceased family. Yeah.
So just, be sure to be sensitive to the cultural needs of, and stop with deceased, or
Well, the
continue on?
deceased and family.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and then yearbooks is where it stuck out for me too with that. And then I'm not sure if there was another one that it was more calling out the student versus a staff.
Yep.
But just doing a read through with that
Yep.
lens. Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like all the changes. So great.
Perfect.
So,
I don't know if, Jamie, if you wanted to talk through next steps with that first. Otherwise, again, I just had one quick observation on 899, just because I did read it for the cross-reference. Is it okay if I just throw that out there quick? It wouldn't
Mhm.
have a to-do tonight because it would probably need to be put on the agenda and come back through.
yeah.
But one of the things that just struck me as I read this policy is in the second paragraph. Is it showing right now? Like, I switched
Mhm.
Yep.
screens. Okay. Policy of the school board is to name buildings at the time of construction. Major components of school buildings, media centers, theaters, gymnasiums, fields, etc., may be named at any time on recommendation from the building principal or action of the school board. And I feel like naming of anything is a pretty big event. And in that language, I would interpret that as if I'm a building principal, I can name just about anything I want. And because it says or action by the school board. And I do feel like permanent namings of things, in my opinion, is a governance kind of activity, and you should at least have the authority to determine that. Now, maybe I'm overreading into it. It just struck me, and I at least wanted to put it out there for consideration. Maybe there are situations that I'm not thinking of that would make this more palatable as written, but to me, it struck me, and I wanted to at least point that out because I happened to read the policy.
Well, and I see what you mean. Then, so if I'm reading the next paragraph, then this is the process for actually. So that's just the recommendation. That's Dave saying, you know what, Pates Field is boring. Let's call it Helke Highlands or something. And so that's just the recommendation, and then it would go
Through the process?
through the process. Is that? And so is the process the next paragraph?
This is the process, yeah.
Yeah, because it just says on recommendation. So it is confusing because it says recommendation of the building principal or by action of the school board. So I can see where those seem like two different things. Like the building principal can just say, I recommend this be changed.
It just may be
Yeah.
I mean, it might be putting a star by it, and when it's reviewed next time through, I don't know if Jamie can put this on a note, but maybe it just continues that statement that says by following the process below to ensure that it ties together the ideas and doesn't stand independently. But again, it's completely up to the board if they think, if you think, no, the language stands alone as it is. It just struck me that it sounded.
It's awkward because it's awkward because actually the school board is what the process is in the next paragraph. And so anybody can make a recommendation probably.
Yeah.
So maybe it's separating that recommendation paragraph there with the action on the next paragraph.
Right. If you read each of those paragraphs separately, you'd almost think they were from different policies, because the paragraph you pointed out, Brian, almost like you said, feels like Dave could say, let's just rename it Helke Field, and it's called Helke Field now. And it's pretty clear in the next paragraph that's not the case, but it's definitely got some odd wording in there.
Yeah, because it doesn't even give, like, that sentence alone doesn't give an inclination that there is a process. It just says may be named at any time on
Right.
recommendation. And so I just think maybe that sentence just needs to be defined or reworded to then say like, somebody may recommend something be named after something, but then it would need to follow the process listed below or something like that.
Yeah.
So we'll bring it back on another policy agenda, Jamie. Is that what we're hearing, everyone?
Yeah, I can do that.
So what should we be putting onto the consent agenda or action items under new business for the policies we reviewed? We know that the policy 532 that we reviewed will come back with some modifications and changes. 615, we all agreed that there wasn't anything that we saw to bring back for any other edits. And then we have policy 599 that we just reviewed with those as the new policy.
That looks good.
So just so I'm clear, is 599 then next step to the board, or do we need to make those adjustments and bring it back to here? I know they're fairly minor, but I didn't know if people here wanted to look at it one more time before.
I'm good with it.
I was going to say, I think with the changes we've discussed, I think it's ready to go before the board for the first reading.
I agree too. So yeah, I would say that could go to a first reading at an upcoming board meeting.
Yeah, looks good.
Is 615 on the consent agenda and then 599 is new business?
I would say so. Because it's like a minor change on 615, so there wasn't any big language change. So I would say that could go through consent, and then the other would be, because it's a brand new policy, go through first reading on new business.
I agree.
Great, are we all good then?
It's like we're done. Look at us, how efficient.
We're so efficient.
Except for my 20 minutes about something that wasn't even on the agenda.
It's okay. That's why we have this committee, Darcy.
That's right.
So I guess we will be adjourning our policy review committee meeting here, and we'll meet again as a committee in August. So we'll see most of you at our board meeting in 2 days.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.